I guess my job is to say welcome. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to talk to you about this work we've been doing at Yale for about 20 years on emotional intelligence. And as you can see here, my name is Mark Brackett. I'm the new director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. There's a pretty rich history to this work at Yale. As many of you may know, our president, who is being inaugurated today, Peter, was the originator of the theory of emotional intelligence. And he and my doctoral advisor, Jack Mayer, back in 1990, wrote this seminal article on emotional intelligence that nobody read. I was lucky that I did read it, but you know how most academic articles go. If you're in the real world, you don't get access to this information. So the idea went pretty much unknown for about 5 years. And then there was a popular book written on the topic by Daniel Goleman that many of you may know. How many of you are familiar with that book on emotional intelligence? How many of you are familiar with my book on emotional intelligence? Yeah, look around the room. Now you know why I have low self-esteem. Yeah. Anyway, the theme is that emotions matter. Now you know more about that. But more seriously, back in 1985, when that book was written, people started hearing a lot about emotional intelligence. And then Peter and Jack and some other researchers like myself started revising the theory of emotional intelligence, developing measurement tools for it, and then studying it to show that it made a difference. So my job today really is to share with you some of the research we've done and also talk with you about the programs that we developed that we are now disseminating throughout the world. So with that note, I want to just share with you what the vision of our center is. We've just converted recently from what we called the Health, Emotion, and Behavior Laboratory, which was a mouthful, where we studied emotions and health behavior. But now we've relaunched just this week officially as the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And the idea behind our center is to use the power of emotional intelligence to create a more healthy, effective, and compassionate society. So we're interested, as you can see, in mental and physical health, how emotions help or hinder that life outcome, being effective in the workplace, and certainly making the world a place where people get along and can get ahead. And along with our vision, we have a mission, which coincides, essentially just adding in the ideas that we conduct rigorous research and develop innovative educational programming. So our goal over the next 100 years is to continuously do rigorous research, but also create innovative educational approaches so that we can teach people of all ages the skills that we believe they need to succeed. So it's my job, I think. You've been here. This is a pretty amazing weekend for all of us. And how many of you have been asked, how are you feeling? Like one person. So I guess my job is to ask you how you're feeling. So I'd like you to take a moment and think about, this is a wonderful weekend. It's a beautiful day. We've got great people here in the audience, bring together the past, the present, and the future of Yale. The first dimension on our mood meter is called pleasantness. It's what's going on for you here in your mind's eye. It's your internal psychological state. And basically, we can rate ourselves from -5 to +5. +5 right now, today, is the most amazing day of your life. There's nothing more than you'd rather be doing than sitting, listening to some guy talk about feelings. -5, you know, you're like, I think I'm supposed to go to that other workshop right now. I'm not sure. Please give yourself a number from -5 to +5. And now I'm going to ask you to take your attention away from here and bring it here, to your body. What is your energy like right now? Are you low energy? You feeling like you need a triple cappuccino? Or are you full of energy and feel activated? -5 would mean that you're about to fall asleep. +5 would mean that you'd love to just jump out of your seat and take over my presentation. And of course, we're going to cross these two dimensions and create our mood meter. It has 4 colors: yellow, red, blue, and green. How many of you are in the yellow right now? You're feeling pleasant with a lot of energy. Raise your hands. Okay. How many are in the green today, feeling pleasant but lower in energy? For some reason, mostly the people are sitting in the back. Sort of reminds me of my teaching days, right? If you're low energy, how many of you are somewhere in the red or blue today? Something's not going right. A little bit red, high energy, and unpleasant. Okay, we're going to keep our eye on you for the day. Blue would be low energy, unpleasant. So most of you are in pretty good shape today, yellow and green. Just for curiosity, is that the reality of your everyday life? For some of you, yes. For some of you, like, no, I'm never yellow or green. I'd like you now for a moment to think about the word, in whatever language is your mother tongue, that best describes how you're feeling at this moment. Take 3 seconds to find that word. And then we'll go dancing. Freeze. Quick raise of hands. How many of you had some trouble finding the best word? Put your hands up really, really high. Really high. Look around the room, please. So over 50% of the room was challenged finding the best word. Any hypotheses about why that might be the case? Yes? It's hard to sum them up. Okay. Other thoughts? Yeah.
English doesn't have a word for high energy pleasant.
Think about it. High energy with a lot of pleasantness. Jazzed. Happy. Elated. Ecstatic. So here we go. We're going to build your vocabulary now. You've already learned something. Write that in your evaluation. Other hypotheses? Yes, back there.
If you're not having a specific clear emotion, it's hard to zero in on just one.
Sure. So you might be having mixed emotions, like when you lose your luggage when you're traveling, right? You're like annoyed at the airline, you're fearful that you're going to have to go without your clothes, etc. One more.
Well, you're sort of assuming we have direct access to our emotions, maybe we don't.
Oh, now you're challenging me. So that's possible. It's a possibility. Maybe we just don't have access to our emotional life because why? I'm putting it back on you now. Yeah, it's possible. Or perhaps maybe we've just never been formally taught to go deep into our emotional lives. Just for curiosity, how many of you drink wine? Wow. Okay. How many of you are really into wine? Yes? So, sir, what kind of wine do you like? Italian wines. And what about the Italian wines do you like?
I just like the range.
The range, what does that mean exactly?
The various different fruits.
The fruits. Anything else? Smoothness. Any particular notes or flavors or dryness?
I like just the classic style.
Okay. So you can see, if you like something a lot, you pay more attention to it, and you'll develop a sophisticated vocabulary about it. My hope is after today, perhaps you'll develop a bit more of a sophisticated understanding of your inner lives. Now, perhaps if I had asked you the reason why you're feeling the way you are, you would have had a little more clarity. So take a moment now and think about, you chose a quadrant, yellow, green, blue, or red. And I'm going to ask you to ask yourself the question, why? What's your reason that you put yourself in that quadrant? Who can share? Who's in the yellow? Raise your hand again. Okay, I'm going to use the front audience. Sir, why are you in the yellow?
Because I feel that way.
Just because you feel that way?
I feel happy.
You feel happy, full of energy, but is there a reason?
I just had a long trip.
Had a good trip, and everything's fine.
The weather,
The weather's nice?
the rain, the sun. What else can I ask?
So there's nothing to do with my presentation. You just randomly showed up today. It's okay. All right. How about for you, ma'am? You're happy and motivated? The inspiration, the progress. Great. Well, that's a nice thing to do. So there are underlying reasons why we feel the way we do. Labeling is important. How about expressing emotions? How many of you believe that you are skilled at masking your true feelings? Raise your hand. How many of you believe that even though you're skilled, most people read through the mask? Okay. So that's a little bit of a conundrum there, right? We'll talk about that a little later. Finally, I'm going to ask you to think about your strategy. So I'll be here for about an hour talking about this work on emotional intelligence, and maybe you'll go on a roller coaster ride of emotions. Maybe you'll feel inspired, then maybe you'll get a little bored, hopefully not. Maybe you'll get irritated with something I say, you'll disagree. My question for you is, what is your strategy for my goal for you is somewhere between yellow and green. I don't want you to be too excited and jumping out of your seats, nor do I want you thinking, being in the deep green, maybe like sitting, on the dock by the bay drinking a glass of wine. I'd like you to be moderately energetic and moderately pleasant. So my question to all of you is, what's your strategy? Yes? Look at the positive things in your life. Very good. Other thoughts? How about for this presentation?
Remember to breathe.
Remember to breathe. That's a good thing. Any other strategies? Yes, ma'am in the red.
Pay attention.
Pay attention. That's an interesting, I want to just go to that for 1 second. How many of you have ever told your child to pay attention? Yeah. How many of you have even done it like this? Pay attention. Yeah. How many of you believe, and how many of your children immediately just pay attention? Yeah. Yeah. So one thing I'm going to challenge you today to think about is when we say things like, how many of you have said something like, I need you to calm down? Anyone? Yeah. And how many of you have shown in your own research that really works well? It tends not to work very well. Pay attention. I need you to focus. Focus. The question is, what are we actually doing to focus? What are the strategies, what are the underlying mental processes that we're teaching children and adults to focus, to calm down, to pay attention? What I've done for you so far is really taken you through the components of emotional intelligence. I asked you to plot yourself. I asked you to think, how are you feeling? Then I asked you to think about the word and the reason for your feeling state. I asked you to consider, how are you expressing this? How are you showing it to the world around you? How many of you believe that where you are on the mood meter is correlated with how you're expressing yourself right now? Raise your hand if you're in the yellow, please. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of feedback. Some of you, yellow, high energy, pleasant. I'm not totally, yeah, there we go. Yellow is yellow, yeah, here, right? And then I'm asking you now at the end to think about the strategy. So my hope for you during this weekend is that you're going to be experiencing lots of pleasant emotions. Joy, contentment, excitement, maybe even go to feelings of ecstasy. So what is this thing about emotional intelligence? The historical view of emotional intelligence doesn't look so great, does it? This is what ancient philosophers, Stoic philosophers, even psychologists, educators said about emotion. Passion and reason are antithetical. Rule your feelings, lest your feelings will rule you. So the idea of an emotional intelligence millennia ago, or even just 100 years ago, probably would not have occurred. As a matter of fact, even more recently, I was taking a car service back from the airport, and the driver asked me, he said, what do you do for work? And I said, I study this thing called emotional intelligence. And he said, emotional intelligence? That's an oxymoron. And that is the way most people think about emotional intelligence. How can you be intelligent about your emotional life when your emotions are these idiosyncratic impulses that drive you to different sides, maybe the dark side? What we now know is a much different story, is that emotions matter, and they matter a great deal for multiple aspects of our daily lives. From our attention, memory, and learning. Has anyone here ever experienced anxiety? How many of you are being treated for enough? We know when we're feeling anxious that it's hard to concentrate. I mean, by definition. our brains are we're either ruminating or we're obsessing on something. Think about, for example, a child who's being bullied in school. What it's like for that child. Worrying about going from class A to class B. Worrying about going from school to home. When your brain is focused on dealing with very strong, unpleasant emotions, how can it be available for learning? Think about it. Now, that's a negative example, but the same thing goes with positive examples. When you're so focused on your upcoming vacation, you just can't wait to go away that weekend. Very hard to focus, unless, of course, you have effective strategies. Decision-making and judgment. Just for curiosity, how many of you have ever made a bad decision? How many of you made a bad decision in the last week? So we're making decisions every day of our lives, every minute, pretty much. And what our research shows is that emotions are behind a lot of our decision making. For example, we now study educators, the lives of educators. And most recently, we published a study looking at how teachers' emotional states affect their evaluation of their students. So how many of you, this is a trick question now, believe that grades are objective? Nobody raises their hand, of course. If I hadn't primed you, you might have changed your mind. So we did a study where we showed that if we put teachers in the yellow versus the blue, just by having them think about a good versus a bad day, that after that few minutes of writing, when we gave them an essay, a middle school student's essay to grade, there were 1 to 2-fold grade differences between the teachers' grades who were in those different mood states. So what's interesting about that is not necessarily, I knew that was going to happen because that's what I study. Negative moods are going to shift you to be more narrow. Positive moods are going to make you more expansive. But for me, the most important piece was this. After the study was over, we asked teachers, do you believe that your emotion state influenced the way you evaluated your student? What percentage of the educators said, of course? 0. You're so pessimistic. Again, most, 90% said there's no way that my emotions would have changed the way I thought about this essay. But yet when we showed them the bar graphs, there was a full grade difference. So what's interesting about that is what? What's interesting is that emotions are affecting our judgments and decision making, but we're not conscious about it. We're not aware of it. More soon. Relationship quality. How many of you, when you're at work, or even in your own family, love to be around the angry, disgruntled, dysregulated family member? Anyone? Like you see that person at work who's always irritated and kind of nasty, and you say, that's who I want to go for coffee with today. Most of us don't want to be around people that display a lot of negative affect. Nor do we want to be around people who misread us constantly. Lots in the relationship quality area. Finally, physical and mental health. When you think about what emotional intelligence is, the ability to recognize and understand and regulate our emotions, how can we be healthy physically or mentally without having effective strategies and self-awareness? So those decades of research led Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer to come up with this idea of emotional intelligence. As a matter of fact, the history of this work is kind of fun. They were both doing independent research projects that were along the same lines, and they became close friends, and Peter and Jack were painting Peter's house when he was an assistant professor here living in Fairhaven. And all of a sudden they were having this conversation. They were talking about their research, and each one, the story is nobody knows who really said it first. My guess is that they don't want to tell anybody about it. And all of a sudden this idea says, well, what if there were this thing called emotional intelligence? And then the aha happened. And the idea was that there are two things. One, individual differences. That some people are just going to be gifted in terms of their emotional life. They're going to read people like that. They're going to have effective strategies to manage their emotions. Other people will not be so skilled in this area. And the other piece of it was that it could be seen as a mental ability, that there would be a way to measure it, and a way to sort of study it to show that it made a difference in people's lives. More recently, we've narrowed these skills down to what we call the ruler skills. The first is recognizing emotions. So for example, looking at all of your facial expressions, and I'm thinking, wow, this is not going so well. I am looking at your facial expressions thinking, okay, are you interested? Are you bored? Are you tired? Are you questioning what I'm saying? That's a natural thing for me as someone who studies this. All of you now will just walk around. I imagine leaving here, going to the inauguration like this. Become paranoid about everybody's facial expressions. Understanding emotions. Where are they coming from? Why do I feel angry? What is the theme, for example, around anger versus sadness versus pride? Labeling. What are the words? Expressing. How do I express myself in appropriate ways in different contexts? And then finally, regulating emotions. So let's break these down a little bit. When we talk about recognizing emotions, we're thinking about it in terms of identifying emotion in oneself, so my own physiology, my own thoughts, and others, by looking at data, facial expressions, body language, posture, gesture, vocal intonation. How many of you can tell how someone is feeling by a conversation on the telephone? You get that vibe, don't you? Let's try it right now. Let's imagine that you want to show the world on the telephone or in person the feeling of compassion. But you're not going to say anything. You're not going to use words. You're just going to use a sound. Are you ready? On the count of one, everyone in here is going to make the sound for compassion. 3, 2, 1, go. Oh, that's nice. So there is something unique about compassion, right? All right, now we're going to do awe. Like you're in awe. I have to be careful because I'm from New Jersey. Awe. You're going to the sound of awe. You're in awe of someone or something. Ready? 3, 2, 1, go. Compassion. That sounded a little bit like despair. Let's go back to awe. All right, we're going. We have some work to do. Understanding of emotion. Where do our feelings come from? How do they influence our thinking, our judgments, our decision making, our behavior? That study I showed you earlier. How, when you're in that yellow mode, do you just sort of like say, that's a great essay? Versus when you're in that blue mood, you say, you missed that little, semicolon, or that's not the best word to describe that feeling state right there. So we know that our emotions are constantly affecting our thinking and judgment. As a matter of fact, you can see from our mood meter now, we can move away from language and start thinking about how the brain works and what are the activities that we might want to engage in a classroom in each of these quadrants. Because there is a bias in our culture, right? Everybody wants to be happy all the time. How many of you believe it's realistic to be happy all the time? That's good. Nobody raised anyone raised their hand. It's not realistic. There's death, there's breakups, there's all these things in life. Yellow is great for creative writing and brainstorming, for example. I want to get people in a group and generate ideas for a topic. Let's go. Put on loud music, everyone gets together, generating ideas. Not the best place for deciding on what you're going to move forward with, though, is it? Think about it. You're feeling really pleasant, everything's fantastic, someone asks you a question, go for it, without really thinking about it. The green is wonderful for building consensus, for getting people's opinions together. Nice, calm energy. So what do you think? Blue. Some people say blue. Why would I want to ever be blue? Well, has anyone here ever wanted someone to express empathy to them? Please raise your hand. Empathy is a good thing. Empathy tends to be a blue feeling. You're expressing your concern. You're expressing your feelings. You're walking in their shoes. So we want children to be able to generate a feeling of empathy. A lot of people say, red, anger. Why would I want anger? Well, think about it. There's injustices in this world. As a matter of fact, my anger for the way our state, not just this state, but our nation, is dealing with bullying, and it infuriates me. It infuriates me that people think that you can solve problems by creating zero-tolerance policies, or by telling people you have to give bystanders, the courage to stand up to the bully. I was one of those kids who was bullied in school. And guess what? I may look pretty confident now, but at 13, I was pretty introverted and quite sensitive. So the idea that someone is going to tell me to stand up to somebody who's bigger than I am and tougher than I am and say, leave me alone, it's pretty scary. It doesn't really take into consideration a lot of knowledge about child development or individual differences in personality. So that anger that I feel about the way our world manages constructs and ideas motivates me. It motivates me to work harder, to go down to Washington, D.C. and make speeches to lobbyists. So you can see here that from our perspective, from an emotionally intelligent perspective, all emotions are valid and important. It's what you do with them. Think about it. That red is useful, but if you're dysregulated and nasty, not useful. If you convert it to passion, now you have a difference. Labeling emotion, building that vocabulary to describe ourselves clearly. So I do this a lot, and I'm going to ask all of you right now. You have 10 seconds to work with someone where you are, and I'd like to know from you what the difference is between jealousy and envy. 10 seconds, go. Morning. Okay, time is up. Who feels confident? Who feels like absolutely confident that they can share? Yes, sir?
Envy is when somebody has something that you would want and you're glad for them they have it.
Okay.
Jealousy is when you don't want them to have it.
Okay. So jealousy is more negative than envy, you're saying. Any other thoughts? This is Yale, by the way. You're supposed to be thinking. Come on, people. Yes, sir.
I associate jealousy with the life of a couple, marriage, and I associate envy with wanting to have what someone else has.
Interesting. So are you a couple? No? Okay, well, that's good. Come here. Come here, come here. By the end of the weekend, isn't it? What's your name?
Dana.
Dana, would you mind coming up?
Oh, no.
Come on. Sorry. No, I need you. No. It takes 2 seconds, I promise.
I have stage fright.
Sorry, you're not going on the stage.
Terrible stage
So everyone, Dana and I, just so you know, we're going on a date. And we're walking down the street, and all of a sudden, what's your name again, sir?
Andres.
Andres. She sees Andres. Just take a look at Andres.
Very handsome.
He's nice, yeah. But I want you to give him a look like you've never given another man. See, it's going to happen. Now, I notice, Dana, right?
Yes.
Looking at Andres that way, how do I feel? Jealous. So now it's obvious. So jealousy is about relationships. Jealousy has to do with I'm jealous that you have a nicer tie than me. I'm envious. But jealousy is about dynamics. It's about relationships. Thank you, Dana.
Thank you.
Now, my question is, some people say, oh, well, this is like intellectual jargon babble. Who cares about the difference? I mean, we just use these terms. Why would I want a child or a teacher to understand the difference between jealousy and envy? Yes?
Well, envy might inspire the child to take action to achieve a positive goal,
Yes.
whereas jealousy is kind of self-defeating.
Yeah. Jealousy can cause more violence, more aggression. So the strategies that I might use or teach a child who is feeling jealous in a classroom will be very different than the strategies I might teach a child who's feeling envious. Expressing emotion. For curiosity, does anyone here know anyone who is socially inappropriate? Anyone? Yeah? That's where this skill comes into play. It's not knowing like the how and the when to express your emotions. I won't give you any personal stories in this area because they're not appropriate. But my point here is that there is that level of appropriateness that has to do with context and culture. I'll never forget when my other career is I'm a martial artist. I know I don't look like one, but I have a 5th-degree black belt in a martial art called Hapkido. And when I've gone to Korea, when I went there the first time, I remember very vividly my American teacher said, "Don't look anybody in the eyes. Right? It's rude and inappropriate." So I remember meeting my teacher saying, "Hello, hello." And of course he thought I was like some weirdo from America. It's not that extreme, right? There's subtle things. Here, right, when I teach in my martial arts studio, everybody, bows. I don't think any of you are going to bow to me at the end of this presentation, although it's not a bad idea. So there are cultural rules that we have to be sensitive to. There are rules between New York and Connecticut. I remember when I was a student in New York City, I would work in coffee shops on the Lower East Side. My friends would come in and say, "Mark, I'm depressed, I'm bloated, I'm tired, I'm irritable." Now I live in New Haven, Connecticut, and it's sort of like, hello. It's a little different here emotionally. I always say, I haven't gotten a hug in 10 years. I'm exaggerating a little bit. But there are differences. There are differences in the way people communicate about emotions. Regulating emotions. How many of you believe that your lives would be somewhat healthier, happier, even better, if you had more strategies to regulate your own emotions? Raise your hand. Most people agree with that. It's interesting. Another question. How many of you believe you'd be healthier and happier if everyone who you lived with had more strategies to regulate their emotions? Yeah. 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 This is when, couples therapy begins after this part. What we want to make sure we do is teach people effective strategies for managing their emotions. And there are a lot of them. Most of us know the negative ones, like negative self-talk, rumination, worry, abusing substances. What about positive self-talk? What about positive reappraisal? What about visualizations? What about other more active strategies like doing some yoga or exercise or taking a walk? And what we know is that emotion regulation is more complex than we originally thought it was. It's not just about down-regulating the negative emotions like anger management and stress management. How many of you have ever taken a course in optimism induction? Think about it. It'd be nice to teach a little bit of strategies to be more optimistic, wouldn't it? Or happiness maintenance. The way we think about emotion regulation is in terms of helping people prevent unwanted emotions, reducing unwanted emotions, initiating emotions that may be necessary to achieve a goal. A good leader, for example, has to be skilled at inspiring his team or her team. You've got to be able to generate a feeling in a room so that people can be thinking in the way that you want them to think, like getting in that yellow for that brainstorming session or in that blue for that reflection. Maintenance to me is interesting. How do you maintain emotions? I always joke that I like to do work in coffee shops. It's just the way I like to do my work. And oftentimes I do my writing in different coffee shops around town, and my brother will call me. And he'll say things like, how you doing? I say, I'm doing fine. Well, I hear all that noise in the background. Where are you? I'm in a coffee shop. Oh, so you're working in a coffee shop? Yeah. So the university pays you to sit in coffee shops. Sort of. And that's okay? And all of a sudden, you're in that flow state, you're feeling really positive, you're working, you start, maybe I should be in my office, am I doing something wrong? Maybe I should be out of here. So you have these pleasant emotions that people try to pull away. Has anyone ever had a dream stealer in their life? Someone who wow, it's great that you get to work in coffee shops. You should come work where I am. And my question is, how do we bring people back up? How do we keep them there? So when I get off the telephone, I'm feeling irritated and annoyed at my brother, that I can go back to that place where I was feeling flow and focused. we spend a lot of time thinking about how do you measure this thing called emotional intelligence. And you can do it in a number of ways. First is you can ask the person directly, and we're going to try that right now. As a matter of fact, we're going to do it a little differently. I want you to look at the person or the people that you came with. Just take a look at them for a minute. Anyway, look at somebody else. Look at a stranger. Somebody you might know. And I want you to just ask yourself this question. How much more emotionally intelligent are you than that person? Raise your hand if you think you're more emotionally intelligent than the person you're with. No, nobody's going to do that. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. When I've done research on this, like paper and pencil, like secret, with my even Yale undergraduate students, 80% say they're more intelligent and emotionally intelligent than their neighbor, than their partner. For those of you who are familiar with like probability and statistics, 80% can't be smarter than the other 80%. So asking the person directly is probably not the way to go. That self-report is complicated, right? Well, if you ask me, like, how emotionally intelligent are you? I say, well, compared to my father, I am an emotional genius. Compared to the Dalai Lama, I need some work. So there's no reference point. It's very complex, our knowledge. First of all, where have we learned to be emotionally intelligent? You can ask other people. How many of you would rely on your children's rating of your emotional intelligence? We won't go there today. But we tend to find that informant reports, or sometimes people call it 360 reports, are really not about your skills, but about your reputation, whether or not they like you or not necessarily how skilled you are at something. And then finally, you can ask the person to solve emotion-related problems, which is the way our center manages the study of emotional intelligence. So Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer and David Caruso developed a test years ago called the Mesquite, which was an ability-based assessment tool. It was asking people to solve problems, look at facial expressions, decode them, give you complicated vignettes and say, what would be the best way to manage that situation? What we're doing now in our center is working with gaming companies to build virtual tests. We're using avatars, so we're going to bring people into a world and requiring you to sort of look at the world and make judgments about expressions and deal with emotions, which we're very excited about. But unfortunately, self-knowledge is quite limited. And it's interesting because our world has tried to move towards very sort of simple ways of doing this. And what our research shows is that measuring emotional intelligence by asking people, like, how good are you at regulating your emotions and things of that sort, just doesn't have any validity. Everybody wants to know, what does this predict about people's lives? We've done a lot of studies on students, young adolescents. What we know is that children with higher emotional intelligence tend to experience less anxiety. They tend to have less depression. They tend to be less likely in middle school and high school to abuse alcohol, drugs, and cigarettes. They tend to be less aggressive and less likely to engage in bullying behavior. They also are perceived by their teachers and their peers as being better leaders. They're more attentive and less hyperactive. And what's important in our nation right now is academic performance. And what we show is that children with higher emotional intelligence just do better academically. They have those skills to manage those challenging moments. What's interesting to me about this work is how powerful that skill of emotion regulation is in determining the quality of your academic performance. And my own life is an example. I was unfortunately, when I was in my early 20s, my mother passed away right before I came and went to graduate school. And I remember being in that room taking the GREs to go to graduate school. And it was just a few months after my mom had passed. And just literally, like, who's the protagonist, who's the antagonist? I mean, I was so just in the grieving space that I couldn't focus. I couldn't take the test well. And I realized it had now, as an adult, a bigger adult, that it had nothing to do with my ability to problem solve. It's just that my emotional life was interfering at that moment in my life with my cognitive ability. And what I hope happens is that people take that more seriously, that people understand the nuances, that some people have anxiety around testing. Some people are in a place in their life where they're not capable of doing complex problem solving because of outside influences, like that child who is being bullied in school. We've worked on emotional intelligence among educators themselves, and look what we know. They're more positive about teaching. They receive more support from their principals. Go figure. They even report greater job satisfaction, have less burnout. We've moved beyond the study of emotional intelligence in children and adults and gone into studying the dynamics of classrooms. So what we do is we work with other researchers to develop systems of coding the quality of interactions between teachers and students. And then what we do is we use those data to predict performance. So for example, a teacher who uses more positive nonverbal behavior, a teacher who regards a student's perspective and brings them into the learning environment, who uses less cynicism and sarcasm. And when we code that using videotaped analysis and then we use it to predict things, we find the following. Students in those classrooms are just more engaged learners. They have better quality relationships with their teachers. They're more pro-social. And they perform better academically. So how many of you are starting to have more buy-in for the power of emotional intelligence? Anyone? If you don't raise your hand, you have to leave. We've also had the opportunity to study managers and leaders of organizations. Because people want to know, well, what does that have to do with the real world, you know, when someone's in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond in the workplace? And as you can see here, adults, managers of organizations are just better off when they have these skills. As a matter of fact, we did a study with a Fortune 100 company recently where we had the 100 managers of this company take our test of emotional intelligence. And we had the CEO, the CFO, and the COO of that organization do a rating of the 100 managers. And that last question was one I just experimented with, which was this. If you had to leave this company tomorrow, would you do anything to take that person with you? And they had to rate every one of those 100 managers on that particular question. That was the strongest correlate of emotional intelligence. People just want to be around people that have these skills. And it's interesting for me because when here I am at Yale University working with some of the brightest students in the world. And this is my first day teaching was in this classroom actually. And I had about 380 students in my class. And I looked at all of them and I said, wow, in 4 years from now, on paper, you're all going to look exactly the same. You have great SAT scores. You have perfect GPAs. You've studied abroad in a country that I've never heard of. You play an instrument that only 3 people know how to play. But you're going to go apply for this job. And you know, I get about 30, 40, 50 applications a year to work in our center now. I don't look at their grades. I mean, who cares at this point? I know they're smart enough to do the work. So what are the things that I'm looking for? Can they work in it as a team? Do they make you feel comfortable? I actually, because I like coffee shops, I have what I call the coffee shop criteria, which is in the first 30 seconds, if I say to myself, I would love to go to have a cup of coffee with this person and just shoot the breeze, that's my decision making. And because I get that feeling that they're going to be interesting, they're going to be creative, they're going to know how to ask you questions. All the things that we tend not to really teach. People always ask, how does this thing called emotional intelligence develop? And of course, you have nature and nurture. Simple, Psych 101. How many of you, just for curiosity, are biologically predisposed, like me, to be more anxious and worried about things? Anyone? Okay. The front row, so you must really want to... They're like, we came to learn. We want those strategies. So that's the nature piece, right? We all have a temperament, a personality. And some of us are more just prone to being attuned and aware of emotion. We also all grew up in a family. Some of us grew up, were raised by wolves. Some of us were raised by people who really knew a lot about emotion. I have a question for all of you. How many of you believe, as you think about your own childhood for a minute, you didn't think you were going to have to do that today, Like, don't do that to me. Believe that you grew up in a family environment where emotional intelligence was nurtured. Please raise your hand. So a few of you. My goal is for that number to be much larger in the next decade. Every parent should be learning these skills. Every parent needs to know how to talk to their students about emotions. I did a training. I was at a boarding school yesterday in upstate New Hampshire, and I had about 150, 200 parents, and one parent said, "So you mean it's okay for my son to be sad?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's okay." "What do you mean? Like, what do you mean by that?" She's like, "Well, like, I just want it to be happy all the time." I said, "That's great. But the reality is that he's going to have some disappointments in his life. And, sometimes being there for a little while." Think about some of our most creative people are the artists of our generation. That sadness is what inspired them to develop their products. As a matter of fact, we now have a study that shows that people who are more creative, just biologically, who are more open to experience, only are rated in terms of their products as being creative when they're high in emotional intelligence. And think about it. Why is that? Because when you're creative and you're trying things out, you're going to fail a lot. You're going to have disappointments a lot. And unless you have those strategies to manage that disappointment, that creative potential just will not be unleashed. Our goal is to make sure, as I say, everybody with a face gets trained in emotional intelligence. Because what we know is that when you have that training from preschool to high school and beyond, you have those important outcomes in life. So I think we're here. I asked you this question already. Most of us didn't get this training. And most of us don't have concrete tools. So what I want to share with you for my last few minutes is, what do we do in schools and other organizations about this thing called emotional intelligence? And we've developed an approach that we call RULER. People in New Hampshire tend to call it RULA. Makes me crazy, but it's okay. And the idea behind RULER is that educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. Not an original quote, by the way. Millennia ago, this was said. My question is, why is it taking until 2014 for our nation's education system to take this seriously? Still pushing. We have a lot of work to do. We have what we call the anchors of emotional intelligence. How many of you remember when you were in school that there were rules? Classroom rules, school rules, right? No running, keep your hands to yourself. Only talk when, this years ago was probably, only talk when spoken to. I mean, all these crazy rules. What we find is that, how many of you like to break rules? I hate rules. I love finding a way to break those rules. We decided to move away from rules and say, let's think about the environment that we want to create. Knowing that positive climate in a classroom matters so much, how can we be what's the word I'm thinking of? How can we be intentional about creating it? So we ask kids and students, how do you want to feel in school? You'd be blown away by what they say. They say, I want to feel respected. I want to feel supported. I want to feel valued. I want to feel empowered. I want to feel inspired. And then we say, well, what do you have to do on a daily basis in order to have those feelings? What are the behaviors that you can engage in to make sure that everyone in your learning environment feels that way? And knowing that there's going to be conflict and aggression, what can we do to prevent it and manage it? And that's done from the leadership down to the student level. We've learned that mood meter already, building that self-awareness. The third tool is called the meta moment. As you can see, it has 6 steps. This is our tool for self-regulation. We make very strong claims in our research that if you take the 6 steps of the meta moment seriously, you can avoid the 12 steps later. Apologies for those of you who I just offended. Step 1 is something happens. How many of you have triggers? Like, you know about triggers, right? Like, if you think about your home life, it's like, didn't we agree that you were going to do that? Remember that? Or at work, people who trigger you? Littlest things, right? The littlest things. Some big things, too. We want to teach people to be aware of their triggers. We know that all emotions affect the way we think, our physiology, and our behavior. So what we're doing is giving children and adults that knowledge of how our emotions are affecting the shift in our thinking. How many of you have been angry in the last month about something? Anyone? How many of you notice when you've been angry, like you're angry about everything? Do you know what I mean by that? Like, I'm not just angry. Do you remember 3 years ago when we went on a vacation? Do you remember that time? Do you remember that? Do you remember last week you promised you were going to pick that up for me? Do you remember that? And do you remember when our child was born? I mean, it's like, you just go back and you just start digging for that, you know, because anger is one of those emotions. You just search for all the reasons. We want to stop that from happening. So you go to step 3 and you take that breath. You activate your parasympathetic nervous system and you take that breath and you bring that hijacked experience down a little bit so that your prefrontal cortex can help you to problem solve and make sense out of it and do something. Because when you're hijacked, how many of you experienced that hijack, honestly? And there's no coming back. I'm going for the jugular. Step we have, see? This is evoking a lot of emotions. Step 4 is seeing your best self. For us, it's important to have motivation to be regulated. You know, I joke a lot. I say, sometimes I take that breath, try to calm down, and I say to myself, wow, how am I going to just rip your head off? So it's not enough to just breathe. You have to know how to shift your mindset. And that's where our best self piece comes in, where we teach children, what does your best self look like? What does it look like for you? You know, this lecture is bringing back memories, because I got the idea for this best self piece working with my colleague Robin, and also by teaching a course where one of my students wrote an article about my course on emotional intelligence. And the article title was The Feelings Master. And I was a little embarrassed by it, of course, you know, like the Feelings Master. But then I started thinking, like, you know, wow, like, how does the Feelings Master walk? You know? The Feelings Master has good posture. I tend to be a schlepper, you know? No, and then the Feelings Master has students. You know, I get some of those winners, you know, like, Professor Brackett, I've got a question, but I'm not sure you're going to know the answer. Love those students, you know? And you know that Feelings non-master is like, all right, you're kidding me, right? Like, you're kidding me. You're kidding me. Did you know about the research that I do on emotions and judgments and grading? Do you remember that? So I can't go there. I got to be the Feelings Master. The Feelings Master says this is a teachable moment. Let's talk about that. Do you think that's the best way to approach your professor, to engage him in the process of higher order thinking? And then when we have that best self activated, we can strategize effectively. We can choose and use adaptive versus maladaptive strategies and then have more success in our social interactions. Knowing that sometimes problem solving doesn't work, that you try it in the moment but you fail. Even I've been working on this stuff for years. Even at home sometimes I think, Mark, you're the Feelings Master. And then that piece from here says, and he doesn't care right now. Go for it. And then, of course, I'm sleeping alone on the couch that night. But you never regret taking him at a moment. I can promise you that. You never regret being your best self. You always regret being dysregulated. Problem solving. We have to teach our children, from our perspective, to empathize, to build perspective-taking skills, to not just look at it from the me, but from the we and the us and the our. So when we have a conflict in schools, what we do is say, it's not just about you. How did you think the other person felt? What were they feeling just before that whole argument got started? And get them to really think about the dynamic in the relationship. And that's our blueprint. And very importantly, we train everybody with a face. I don't care who you are in a school, whether you work in the front office, or whether you work in the back office, or whether you're the superintendent or the preschooler. Everybody's learning this stuff. And we have a theory for why that makes a difference. We don't just sit in coffee shops all the time, by the way. We actually do science. And what we know is that when you train leaders, teachers, and staff, when you train this classroom and give that curriculum in that classroom, and when you bring in families and teach parents the same skills and the same tools that their children are learning, great things happen. You get to enhance the skills of all people in that environment, and that also helps to shift simultaneously the culture. So there's a common language. So a superintendent can walk into the preschool and say, hey, how are you feeling today? And the little boy will say, I'm in the yellow. And me too. What's your strategy? I'm going to stay there. And then we show in our research that when you enhance people's emotional intelligence and shift the culture and climate, you get those important outcomes that we all care about for our children and the adults involved in their education. Better engagement and achievement, better relationships, less bullying and aggression, greater health and well-being. Just do it at the end. We've done a number of research studies to show that this stuff really matters. Experiments in schools to show that when schools can adopt this approach, these are the kinds of outcomes you can expect. Less anxiety and depression. Children become better problem solvers, have greater social and leadership skills, experience fewer attention and learning problems, and they also perform better academically. That climate that I said matters so much, we've shown that we can shift that as well. We shift between 10 and 50% in just 1 year. All three of these. The emotional climate. Children feel more engaged. They want to be there. The instructional climate. Teachers become better instructors in general. Better modeling of language. Better classroom management. So I'm going to wrap up today by showing a short video. I have had the privilege to travel around the world to do this work. And right now, our approach, called Ruler, is in about 700 schools throughout the world. And many years ago, I was in England, where I began a lot of my international work. And I had the opportunity to really do some interesting studies in England, as well as create a lab in a school. And there was a little boy in this school who I never met until after he had been trained in emotional intelligence. His name is Gareth. And Gareth was a little boy who was horrifically bullied in his elementary school and then went to this middle school that was very different. They had embraced emotional intelligence. And this is a poem that he wrote in his class on emotional intelligence about his experiences of bullying and the way he thought about it now as a little bit different than he thought about it previously.
You're ugly. I know, I have been told this. You're silly. I know, I have realized this. You look like an alien. I know this has been pointed out to me. You have big eyes. I know, I have looked in the mirror. You can't be a pilot, you're not smart enough. It is possible, I have considered this. With every insult you invent, it's strange but it's true. You point out my many failings and help me to improve. As you highlight our many weaknesses, you also highlight our strengths. My ugliness leads to my kind personality. My silliness brings laughter to the world. Our resemblance to movie aliens only highlights my intelligence. My big eyes portray my feelings and widen my view. I may not make it as a pilot, but I could be. You see, every insult you invent gives me a view into your mind. And though I have many problems, I feel sorry for you. Why, oh why, do I feel sorry for you? Because your mind cannot break free. The wall of insults you build limits your mind and feelings. So soon as you don't stop, you'll turn inhuman and have the biggest problem of all, loneliness. Think about it.
So, as we think about this boy's life in school, how was he able to he was a CD failing student in 5th and 6th grade. How could he have been successful when that's the way he felt about his life, when that's the way he thought other people felt about him? Gareth went into this school where he was feeling much safer, more confident. He was developing skills. And he wrote this poem, and originally they were doing public speaking, and he said, I'm not ready, and I'm scared to share it, because I don't know what's going to happen if I share it. And the teacher, of course, having been trained, said, well, you know what, Gareth? That's okay. You don't have to share it right now. But is it okay if I share it with other teachers? He said, that would be fine. So here is now in this new middle school, the poem has been brought around, and teachers come out, Gareth, my goodness, you're so articulate. Gareth, that poem, how meaningful, how wonderful that poem was. His self-esteem is building. He says to his teacher a few weeks later, I'm ready to read it to the class. He reads it to the class. Lo and behold, he gets a standing ovation from his peers. They say, we wouldn't treat anybody like that here. That's not the way we do business in this school. And what's interesting about Gareth, this is about 3 or 4 years ago now, I've gone back to this school. He's in high school now. And I remember sitting just about 2 years ago in the cafeteria, having meetings, and he came up to me, "Sir, do you remember me?" I said, "Of course I remember you. I've been exploiting you throughout America." I said, "Of course I remember you." And he goes, "I want to be a poet." I said, "That's fantastic." And he goes, "And I have a girlfriend now." I said, "Great." And he says, "Do you want to read some more of my poems?" I said, "Absolutely." And he's like, brings me this pile of things. And he walks away and he says, "Sir, look for me on the bookshelves." I can take credit for Gareth because I wasn't his teacher. And I get emotional just thinking about it, because when I think about what it was like for him, like it was for me, in elementary school, not having that ability to connect, not having that ability to feel safe and valued. How could you survive in that environment? Now he's in a place where he feels safe, where he feels valued, where he can succeed. From the reading of his poem, we know that he's academically gifted, but you can't show your academic or cognitive ability if you're feeling oppressed or you're feeling unvalued or not valued. So I will end today by reading a poem by Rumi that really gets at the value and importance of all emotions. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door, laughing, and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend here at Yale. It was indeed a privilege and a pleasure to present to all of you. Thank you.